Hello, and welcome to the introductory podcast of Intellectual Conversations with Jason Sylvester. I'm proud to have Dimitris Vardoulakis, who is a philosophy professor at Western Sydney University, who's an expert in Spinoza, who's also written a book called Spinoza the Epicurean. Dimitri was very, very helpful to me. I was working on my book Dangerous Ideas, which I'm still working on. Uh, and in my chapter on Spinoza and Hobs, Dimitri, who had just written Spinoza the Epicurean, when I got to that section of my book, it was just one of those universal coincidences. He had just happened to publish it at exactly the moment I was looking for it. So I reached out to him at the university, and we started a correspondence. He was kind enough to send me a PDF copy of the book, and work with me to sort of explain and elucidate some of the more complex thinking of Spinoza. So today's topic will be on Benedict Spinoza, and primarily drawing from his book Spinoza the Epicurean. So Dimitri, thank you for joining us today and taking time out of your busy schedule.
Thank you, Jason, for inviting me. Great to be here.
Yeah. All right. So let me just minimize this a little bit. I've created a list of some topics to talk about. So maybe like right off the bat, one of the issues that I came across with him was that he can be a little bit inscrutable in what he's saying. The era in which he's living in, like his friend Adrian Korba had been jailed and died in jail for daring to criticize religion. Um, so one of the things I've come to the conclusion that to fully understand Spinoza, you can't just read ethics. You can't just read the theological political treatise. You kind of need to read everything because he's saying different things in different places, particularly in his letters. He seems to be more honest in his letters than in, say, the TTP. Let me just give you a quick example that I highlighted. So, in his letter 30 to Henry Oldenburg in 1665, he states, I'm currently working on a treatise giving my views about Scripture. I am led to do this by the following considerations. One, the prejudices of the theologians, for I know that they are the greatest obstacle to men's being able to apply their minds to philosophy. And number three, that the preachers here suppress it as much as they can with their excessive authority and aggressiveness. Yet, in the preface of the Theological Political Treatise, he states, we live in a republic in which everyone is granted complete freedom and judgment. So there's a little bit of hyperbole going on there in the TTP where he's not being completely honest, particularly against those letters. So would you concur that he tends to be a little bit inscrutable, and what he's saying in the TTP versus what his private correspondence, he tends to be a little bit more honest? Would you think that's a fair assessment?
Well, I think everybody, when they're writing, they're addressing a particular audience. And I think, writing to Oldenburg, who is a very learned man, a very significant figure within Great Britain, the audience here is a particular kind of audience, whereas when he's writing the theological political treatise, there's a different audience. Most certainly, if you look at the preface, part of the audience that he has in mind is the censor, and he's trying to ensure that the publication of the book will not be censored, basically, will not be put out of circulation by the authorities. So it is significant to consider who is addressed in every particular in any particular chapter. It is also in terms of the inscrutability, to use the term of the theological political treatise, I find it somewhat surprising that scholarship hasn't really pointed out that if we look at the book stylistically, even in terms of words that are repeated, with different spelling, for instance, throughout the book, it seems to me that there are at least three phases in which the book was written. Sure, the letter in 65, letter 30 that you refer to, suggests that the book is about to be written at that point. But he doesn't actually say that explicitly. He doesn't, in letter 30, he doesn't sort of say, oh, I'm starting from scratch. It seems to me that there are three parts to the theological political treatise. The first 6 chapters, which are roughly their main topic, is the notion of authority, and it is approached through the figure of the prophets and Moses in particular. Then chapters 7 to 15 to 14, when the issue of scriptural authority, that is authorship, but authorship and authority, of course, in Latin is the same word. That's what the issue is there, and that's where we have a lot of references to the Hebrew Bible, and there's a different kind of stylistic mode. And then the last few chapters that seem to me to be much more speculative, much more chapters in the mode of political theory or political philosophy, and there the audience is different, the vocabulary is different again. So it seems to me that if of course, every old book is in conversation with a particular literature, a particular audience of the time, but in order to eliminate some of the inscrutability of the theological political treatise, we need to sort of pay a little bit closer attention to these three kind of distinct parts of the text. That it seems to me that they're addressing different questions, and therefore their primary audience is different in each instance.
Right. And in that third part, uh, it seems to be in letter 30 to Oldenburg, he said he's working on a theological treatise. And yet the political treatise, that last part, has been speculated by others, by Edwin Curley, by Stephen Nadler, who's done quite a few bios on Spinoza, speculate that this was influenced by Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, which had just been translated into Latin around 1667 and into Dutch in 1668. So that the Delacour brothers, who were very much into Dutch republicanism, introduced Spinoza to Leviathan. So do you feel that the the third part, like the last chapters, like 15 or 16 to chapters 20, where he's making these political arguments, do you feel this is very much influenced by his exposure to Leviathan and Dutch republicanism?
There's no question that Leviathan was a major figure at that time. Whether the Leviathan or the Chiva is the major influence of the theological political treatise, I'm not sure. It seems to me that there is strong textual evidence, for instance, in chapter 16, that the Chiva was the book that Spinoza was looking at. I explained that in some detail in my book, why I think the Chiva was possibly of more influence than the Leviathan. But there is no doubt that through the circle of collegians, which were a kind of radical political group that Spinoza was part of, and they were the people that he was communicating with, sending drafts of his works, and so on and so forth. That's the very group that is translating Hobbes into Dutch and into Latin. So um, um, there is no doubt that Spinoza would have been aware of Hobbes, but I'm not really sure whether the Leviathan or the Chiva was the primary influence. And maybe if we think about the argument of the theological political treatise, maybe that doesn't matter too much because of course, there are shifts between the Chiva and the Leviathan, but where the shifts occur, maybe they don't really affect the sort of engagement with Hobbes that we find through the theological political treatise. Um, I'm not sure whether that answers your question or whether you want more details.
No, no, it's fine. I saw a lot of parallels between Levi. My whole chapter on Spinoza and Hobbes is essentially a comparison between the two, where they align and the few places where they disagree. Um, I did like one of the big differences between the two, obviously, is uh, Hobbes is advocating for like a supreme monarch, whereas as Spinoza wants like a republican of educated elite men who are responsible to the people, whereas Hobbes wants like this absolute monarch. So there's that difference. But then I recall yesterday seeing one of my notes. I think it in De Chive that Hobbes had kind of shifted away from that absolute monarchist in Leviathan to be more in line with Spinoza and the Chive. So
Yeah, I look, I'm not sure I will exactly describe the relationship that way. I mean, I'm interested in the Epicurean tradition and how it influences political thought in early modernity, starting with the father of political theory and political philosophy, Machiavelli, who is profoundly influenced by Epicurean philosophy because, as you know, the Epicurean writings had disappeared for centuries. The two major sources of Epicurean philosophy, Lucretius De Natura and Diogenes Laertius, The Lives of Philosophers, which has a long chapter. The longest chapter is on Epicurus, and within that chapter, he copies three letters and the principal doctrines of Epicurus, which is the only exact existing
yeah,
writings of Epicurus that have survived. All these writings get published in Florence shortly before Machiavelli becomes active, and Machiavelli himself becomes very fascinated with this tradition. For instance, we have a copy of the entire poem by Lucretius De Natura in Machiavelli's hands. So my interest was, well, if there is this fascination with Epicurean philosophy, how does that influence their political thinking, and a political thinker like Machiavelli? Why is it that political thinker like Machiavelli turns to Epicurean philosophy? And it seems to me that the critical concept, the central concept in Epicurean philosophy, political philosophy, has to do with the calculation of utility, what Epicurus calls ο επιλογισμός του συμφέροντος, συμφέρον being the term for utility, utilitas in ancient Greek. So one of the ways in which this idea of a calculation of utility is translated in the 17th century is an expression that we find scattered in various 17th century philosophers, including Hobbes and Spinoza, almost in exactly the same words. And that's the expression that when we're faced with a choice, we choose the best of the two alternatives or the least harmful of the bad alternatives. This is an expression that we find in the Chiva. Later, we hear it in the Leviathan, and we find it in part four, for instance, of the Ethics, and we find it repeated also in the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus. So, if that becomes the sort of central motor, if you want, of Epicurean politics, what is it that is to be calculated before we act? And that becomes the basis of ethics and politics. Then, what is the difference between Hobbes and Spinoza? And the argument that I put forward is that there is one fundamental difference from which the rest of the differences follow. Namely, for Hobbes, because of his anthropology, psychology, what philosophical anthropology, psychology, whatever you want to call it, Hobbes privileges one particular emotion. So when the Epicureans say that what matters is how we calculate our utility, this is very different from the utilitarian conception of calculation that we find in the 17th century. The utilitarians believe that it's possible to calculate utility as an individual. You can calculate utility correctly because you have a calculus. Oops, sorry. You have a calculus that helps you calculate utility correctly, and so on. Whereas for the Epicureans, this calculation is always situated within a particular environment, which includes the emotions, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And that means it's always political. And because it's situated within an environment which is changing, it's historical, it's contingent, the calculation can never be certain. It is always fallible. So I argue that both Spinoza and Hobbes take on this Epicurean idea, this materialist idea, and they do something different with it. For Hobbes, privilege is one emotion and says the primary political emotion is fear, fear for one's life, okay? And runs his whole kind of political anthropology based on the emotion of fear. This is not part of the classical Epicurean tradition. Spinoza is much closer to the classical Epicurean tradition in that he does not privilege any emotion. All sorts of different emotions are just as good as any other. It's a matter of contingent circumstances, which one holds sway. So I read their differences based on that fundamental initial difference about how they have a divergent understanding of the calculation of utility.
And speaking of Epicureanism, that was the next topic I wanted to dive into because when I first started reading the TTP, within 5 minutes, I was struck by what occurred to me as to be a very Buddhist sort of philosophy in his writing. So I emailed Stephen Nadler, who had written Nadler's written several bios on Spinoza. I'll put some links in the description for people. Uh, so I emailed him and I asked him about this, and he said, no, this is Greek Stoicism, and I'm like, no, it's not. Uh, is I would think, and I've got a quote from. Let me just look it up. Um Jonathan Israel in Contested writes, all the affinities between Spinoza and the Stoics in the end, Pierre Bayle came to see are more apparent and real. Because it appears that in some of Bayle's early writings, so Historical and Critical Dictionary, and Philosophical Commentary, and the Republican Letters, uh, he's connecting Spinoza to the Stoics, and then in his Bayle's later writings. So has that sort of stigma would be the wrong word, but that I mean, how, in your opinion, if you're aware of it, like, are there still many Spinoza scholars who think he's a Stoic, or that's just such a minority now, and most people recognize that he's an Epicurean?
I don't think there's many people who would talk of Spinoza as an Epicurean. I think most certainly the in the minority here. I mean, I would love to be able to say that most people recognize him as an Epicurean, but that is most certainly not the case. Moreover, I think many people who write on Spinoza write about him as if he were a Stoic, even though they do not recognize that the language that they're using is Stoic language. And I think that's the influence, the profound influence in Spinoza studies that Deleuze has exercised. There are two key characteristics to Stoicism: the so-called Stoic monism, namely the idea that whatever exists is a totality outside of which nothing else exists, or the idea that there is no creation out of nothing. So that's the so-called Stoic monist kind of principle. And the second is that in terms of the political anthropology or the psychology, use the terminology I was using before. What is critical in Stoicism is this idea between activity and passivity that we find outlined in the psychology of part 3 of the Ethics. And it seems to me that if you just read part 3 of the Ethics, there's an argument to be made that Spinoza is indeed a Stoic philosopher. It seems to me that if you move to part four, which starts with the definition of the good as that which has utilitas, there that's completely reconcilable with Stoic philosophy, and that is a principle that you find in Epicureanism. And it seems to me also that that is the case if you turn to the theological-political treaties, the sort of impassioned, engaged language that you find in the theological-political treaties, where contemporary events might not be mentioned by name, but they're alluded in a way that his contemporaries would have known what he's talking about, make his attitude far removed from the sort of impassioned attitude of the Stoic sage. So it seems to me that the Epicurean interpretation through Deleuze, who places such great emphasis on that interplay between the active and the passive, holds sway nowadays in the majority of the interpretations of Spinoza, at least most certainly in the continental tradition, in affect studies, the way post-human studies might be approaching Spinoza, and so on. Um, uh, and they may be adopting a Stoic interpretation, even though they do not recognize that simply by following in Deleuze's footsteps. Now, the difficulty with this approach is that in order to work that sort of Stoic reading of Spinoza, it has to leave out such a great part of Spinoza, for instance, parts 4 and 5 of the Ethics. Or Deleuze has barely anything of interest to say about the theological-political treatise. You know,
Yeah.
it has to leave out so much that we can accept that there is a Stoic Spinoza, but that Stoic Spinoza is just a very small part of Spinoza's philosophy overall. So part of the, I started reading Spinoza in that mode under the influence of Deleuze. And because I had to teach in a context of teaching political philosophy, and I had to turn to the theological political treatise to teach my students, I just couldn't reconcile what Deleuze was saying in his Stoic interpretation of Spinoza with what the text of Spinoza was saying, the kind of text that Deleuze kind of refuses to interpret. And that's when I sort of start realizing maybe, Spinoza is the opposite of Stoicism. Of course, you remember in ancient times, the two major philosophical schools were the Stoics and the Epicureans, who were kind of fighting with each other, and it seemed to me that there are certain clues within Spinoza that he is anti-Stoic. Just to give you one example, in the preface of part 5 of the Ethics, he disparages out of nothing. There's no obvious reason why he does that. He disparages the Stoic conception of freedom. So why does he do that? I mean, of course, he cannot say in the 17th century that he is an Epicurean. Look what happened to Giordano Bruno. He's still very much perceived as a highly heretical position to occupy. But he can say, "Hey, I'm not a Stoic," which,
Yeah.
for anyone who's interested in the history of philosophy, knows that the opposite of Stoicism is Epicureanism.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, that's one of the points that you helped me with in letter 56 to Boxell. He writes, "The authority of Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates is not worth much to me. I would have been amazed if you had mentioned Epicurus, Democritus, Lucretius, or any of the defenders of the atoms." And I do remember you and I having a conversation about that. You had pointed me to that letter, that this was kind of a hint of him being an Epicurean, but he doesn't outright come and say that I'm an Epicurean. He's just saying, I'd be surprised if you'd mentioned it. And I remember asking you, like, why doesn't he just come out and say it? And you were saying the time he's living in, the Epicureans are still looked down upon by the Christian hierarchy, and so he has to be he has to be rather subtle. And this kind of comes back to my very first point, that you really need to read everything that Spinoza writes because there's clues sprinkled throughout his writings on what he's saying. Because as I said, like he says one thing in the intro to the TTP, and another in letter 30, and then this other one in letter 15, and these clues are there. But if you just read one book, you're kind of missing the bigger picture,
Mm.
where like these little clues are sprinkled throughout his writings. Um,
That is true, but there is one other issue that I think is really, really important, and that is that there has been a very peculiar history of reception of Spinoza, which has profoundly influenced the translation of his books from Latin into all sorts of different languages, English, French, German, Greek, whatever. And that is that after almost 150 years of his books being banned, his name gets reintroduced in the discourse through controversy about the Enlightenment that Jacobi instigates. In fact, there were two controversies. The second controversy led effectively to the sacking of Fichte from the University of Vienna, and it's precisely in Vienna, shortly after Fichte was forced to leave, that the first modern edition of Spinoza's works, the Paulus edition, comes out. And it is from this Paulus edition then the first translations occur. And it seems to me that these translations are positioned already within a very specific context, the context of the sort of mainstream Enlightenment, as it kind of leads all the way to transcendental idealism. And then from there, we'll lead to debates about, political debates, for instance, about liberalism in the 20th century with Leo Strauss, or the sort of historical approach that kind of leads to Deleuze and the interpretation of Spinoza as a Stoic, and so on and so forth. So if we're aware of this very kind of unusual reception history of Spinoza, a history that can think of even remotely kind of similar history for any other major philosopher, then it may make sense that indeed that sort of recognition that he is an Epicurean, that it seems to me in writers like Bale that you mentioned before, is there very much in the foreground. If we if we're influenced by that reception history from the late 18th to early 19th century onwards, then it is easy to miss the Epicurean aspect. But if we look at how he's read when he first gets published, Bale again is the prime example. As you know, Bale was a very significant figure at the end of the 17th century. He writes the first major encyclopedia of thought, where he devotes a very long section on Spinozism, which was the only source of Spinoza's philosophy in the ensuing 120, 130 years where his books were banned. So Hume, Kant only knew Spinoza from Bale's interpretation. And Bale presents Spinoza as an atheist because of his ontological commitments. He says, if God is all encompassing, if there's nothing outside God, then how can you possibly make any kind of judgments about how to act? Whether you act in one way or another, everything is within God, so everything is the same. But that is the argument about against the Epicurean philosophy that you find within the tradition. The argument that because of this notion of an ontology that there's nothing outside it, the Epicurean philosophy is unable, who first is atheist because it does not accept God as a creator, it does not accept creationism, and secondly, it has no ethics in politics, or it is immoral. Yeah? So it seems to me that if we look at the earlier reception, that it's possible to see the Epicurean influence. the later reception skews that perception, and this filters, and that's the crucial point, into the translations of Spinoza. So I mentioned earlier that it seems to me the absolutely central point for understanding Spinoza as an Epicurean is to see that notion of to sympheron from Epicurean philosophy as translated in terms of utilitas and its cognates into Latin. Now, if you look at any English edition of translation of Spinoza's works, there's not a single example of a translator who recognizes that the term utilitas is a technical term for Spinoza, and therefore translates it contextually as advantage, benefit, this or that or the other. And therefore, the sort of rigor of the language that points to those who are in the know, to the utilitarian provenance of Spinoza's argument, to the Epicurean provenance of Spinoza's argument or Epicurean influence, is completely lost in the translation. Because people don't recognize, unless they go into the Latin, that actually, what he says in definition 1 of part 4 of the Ethics, namely that the good is that which is utilities, and what he says about the Hebrew state, which is his primary example of a nation state, of a sovereign state in the Theological-Political treaties, namely that it was organized on the principle that the state catered for the utility of the people. Unless people read that in these two sentences in the Latin, they don't understand that it's the same word here. And it's really difficult then to link it back to the notion of sympheron in Epicurean philosophy.
Yeah. So maybe just for our viewers who probably are not all that familiar with the Stoics and Epicureans, so just to give a little background to people, and you can please feel free to correct me. So when I saw this Buddhist element in him, and I started my search, and I said, Nadler said, no, he's a Stoic. I'm like, this is very Buddhist. So let me just give one quick example here. So in Ethics 5, the preface for Ethics 5, he says, at length, I pass to the remaining portion of my ethics, which is concerned with the way of leading to freedom. I shall therefore treat therein the power of the reason, showing how far the reason can control the emotions, and what is the nature of the mental freedom or blessedness. Now, to me, that sounds very, very Buddhist, very like nirvana. Now, in my investigation, so what I came across then was another. I was actually a professor, so I have a friend who's a professor of philosophy in Canada, and I emailed him about this, and I said, "Hey, wait, this looks very Buddhist. Like, is this something that's regularly taught in philosophy about Spinoza?" So he found an article for me written by a professor who actually lives in the same city I do, and so I'd reached out to him. His name is Soraj Hongwadaram. Apologies if I butchered the name. And he had written an article that says, why aren't more people talking about the fact that Spinoza's Buddhism? And he lists like maybe five, like over the last century. And he lists like these. There's like maybe only five scholars who've actually recognized and talked about the fact that there's a very, very Buddhist element to Spinoza's writing. Um, and he pointed me to a book by one of his professors when he was doing his studies, Christopher Beckwith, called The Greek Buddha. And in that, it talks about how the Greek philosopher Pyrrho travels with Alexander and into the Indus Valley, encounters Buddhism, and brings it back into Greek philosophy. And so Pyrrhonism then goes. It never established its own school, but essentially a proto-skepticism. But Pyrrho influences both the Stoics and the Epicureans. And that's why, like, so the Buddhism strain kind of comes through both because they both have this notion of nirvana, which in Greek, and please correct me if I mispronounce, is ataraxia. That's correct? So
That's
ataraxia
correct.
is sort of is the Greek term for nirvana, this peace of mind. And so there's a big difference in the cosmology of the Stoics, where the Stoics believe in a creator god, but the Epicureans do not. And so that's where you sort of this Buddhist strain comes down through Pyrrho and then splits into the Stoics and the Epicureans, and then that's why the Buddhism is apparent, but a lot of people think he's a Stoic. And then, as you said, like it's he's much more in line with the Epicureans. And then when I read, and please again for help me if I pronounce letter to Menocius. Is that correct? The correct pronunciation?
Sure.
Menocius. I was reading Epicurus's letter to Menocius, and it just hit me like a ton of bricks. This is everything Spinoza's saying. Every single thing Spinoza's saying in the TTP and his other writings, it's all encapsulated in this one letter to Menocius. And obviously there's other things like letter to Herodotus and stuff, but it was the letter to Menocius that just boom, like the light just went off. I'm like, oh my God, this is everything Spinoza's saying. And that's when I Googled Spinoza the Epicurean, and I came across you, and you had just, I mean, you talk about cosmic coincidences, you had just released your book, Spinoza the Epicurean. And I thought, okay, wow, this is great. So like, okay, I'm not going off in the wrong direction, because here's Professor Vardoulakis, who's just written this book about how he's an Epicurean. So that I said I reached out to you. You were really, really helpful to me in helping to solidify some of my thinking, maybe correct where I was going in the wrong direction. So I think it's I think it's kind of important that, as you said, like a lot of people still think he's a Stoic. As I said, even Professor Honglateram in his says, like, there's very, very few people who even recognize the Buddhism in Spinoza's thought, um, including and there's a quote from Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer himself states he and Bruno would be at home on the banks of the Ganges. So even Schopenhauer recognizes this Eastern influence in his thinking, fairly early on. So and again, this is why I think S- Spinoza seems to mean different things to different people, and I think people are reading into Spinoza maybe what they want to see. Do you think that's a fair assumption, or he's just
Yeah,
because he's yeah,
I think you're painting a really compelling picture. I think if we are to talk about influences of ancient Greek thought on modern thought, and exhibit A here is the notion of the Renaissance, which is essentially a revival of ancient thought. If we are to talk about that kind of influence, it is critical, it is crucial to understand that ancient Greek thought is influenced by the East in a profound way. Pyrrhonism is one example, and of course, the ancient school of thought that was most profoundly influenced by Pyrrhonism was the academic, was the Platonic school, especially the middle academy during the Hellenistic period, is profoundly influenced by Pyrrhonism, and that gives it also a profound influence from the East, which kind of arises uh, with various discourses. Anyway, look, we don't need to go into the details on that now. But uh, all I'm trying to say is that it is important to recognize that there are all these influences from the East that early Renaissance does not really recognize, but then people in the 19th century, like Schopenhauer, or later, of course, Nietzsche, are very keen to point out. But it seems to me, in addition, that there is one profound similarity that is at the basis of every kind of convergence that we find between ancient Greek thought and Eastern thought, be that Buddhism or Hinduism or whatever. And that similarity consists in the first fundamental ontological commitment that all ancient Greek thought and all Eastern thought share. And that is the ontological commitment that came to be called in the 18th century monism, namely the rejection of the idea that there is anything transcendent, the rejection of the idea, well, for the Greeks or the Buddhists or the Hindus, that idea hasn't even crossed their mind that something can be created out of nothing. No one in ancient Greek thought argues that. Everybody agrees that miden ek to midenos. It is impossible to create something out of nothing. We find this expression throughout Greek philosophy. Look at how it's treated in Aristotle's metaphysics and so on. So that initial kind of ontological commitment is common to ancient Greek thought and to Eastern thought, but it is irreconcilable with Judeo-Christian metaphysics, because Judeo-Christian metaphysics is creationist metaphysics. So that kind of makes it easy to say, hey, look at Spinoza, he's a monist, and there was all these sort of similarities with another monist thought like Buddhism. And then, I completely agree with that. So long as we do not understand by that, there is a kind of narrative here of influence. I do not believe that Spinoza was actually influenced by Buddhism. I believe that the shared Buddhism and Spinoza, as well as all the materialists in the 19th century, share a common ontological commitment that is really very grounding for their whole philosophy, namely monism.
So speaking of his ontological argument, I've got that in here too. So in Ethics 1, Proposition 11, um, a, a lot of people are thinking, he uses the term God, but one of the scholars I read, I cannot remember who it was at this point, says if you just substitute the word nature for God in his ontological argument, he's just essentially arguing for the existence of the physical universe, and he's using God because like that's a term people are familiar with. So, and as you said, like people um, have accused Spinoza of being an atheist, but also in that letter 30, when Spinoza's writing to Oldenburg, and he's saying, "I'm writing this treatise because the people keep accusing me of being an atheist." So, do you think Spinoza was an atheist, or do you think he was just basically covering his ass in a very dangerous time where, like, his friend Adrian Korba had been jailed and died, and so he's being a little bit more protective. For the people who don't know about the TTP, he it was published anonymously. It was said it was to be published in Hamburg with a fake publisher. So he took a lot of precautions to protect himself. So when he protests about being accused of an atheist, do you think he was an atheist, or do you think he really saw God in nature?
There's no, what do you mean by God? I think there's two ways of understanding the notion of God. One is the Judeo-Christian way of understanding, the so-called monotheistic religions kind of way of understanding God. That is the understanding of God as creator, and therefore God as being of an ontological quality that is radically distinct from anything material that we can experience in our everyday life. That's the sort of legacy of Judeo-Christian metaphysics. God is something other than us. We have, various wonderful renderings of that. Augustine, in his Confessions, kind of repeating how he's trying to address God, but God never responds. Why? Because God cannot respond. He's of a different ontological quality than Augustine. By contrast, there's a whole tradition that sometimes uses the word God, sometimes uses the word nature. It doesn't matter. That does not understand God in creationist terms, does not believe that there is something that exists which is of a radically different ontological quality than what determines me, you, and the physical reality around us. Okay, so in that second sense, I think Spinoza does believe in God in that second sense, but that is the God of the ancient Greeks as well as many other religions. There is this wonderful book by Vernon and Etienne called "The Life of the Greek Gods" or something like that, which basically describes, how steep in material reality the Greek description of the gods is, and in that sense, the gods of the ancient Greeks are nature. It's just nature presented from a multiplicity of perspectives. And from that point of view, Spinoza does believe in God. Now, what is kind of outrageous about Spinoza is that he's writing at a time, at a place where there was a monopoly on how you define God. Namely, you define God within the terms of Judeo-Christian metaphysics, God as creator, God as someone who creates something out of nothing. He goes and writes extensively about God. The whole part one of the ethics is basically a meditation on the nature of the divine, of God, and provides a kind of cogent argument and a cogent kind of description of God, which not only describes God in non-creationist terms, but also says, think for instance of chapter 5 on miracles of the Theological-Political treaties. It also says that if you believe in a creationist God, you are the real atheist. And that is completely outrageous for any Christian at the time, because he takes the notion of God and kind of turns it inside out and shifts the whole definition of God, like appropriates the name in order to shift the definition of God into an anti-creationist register, into a monist register.
And I think that's what confuses a lot of people because he uses the term God. And I would speculate that he's using it because it's a term people are familiar with and that they can relate to it. And I think this is what leads to a lot of confusion for people and why everybody kind of has a different opinion of him because they some see him as an atheist, some see him as a like Rebecca Goldstein. Just I asked her the same question back when I was researching, and she's like, I would call him a Spinozaist. That he's completely unique. He's creating a. Actually, I have the note here. So Rebecca was actually kind of she had a 1 hour Zoom call with me during COVID when I was researching. So I really appreciate her for that. And she says he's a wholly new moral philosophy, the first in modern European history to be based on a humanist ethic, not a theological one. So would you agree with that sentiment?
Look, I mean, I probably need a little bit more context. The only thing I would like to say in this kind of set of ideas that you're describing, with which I agree, of course, is that I'm not sure how unique Spinoza is. It seems to me that we're far too influenced by a kind of Judeo-Christian metaphysics that even if we say, oh, I do not believe in God or I'm an atheist or whatever, we still take a lot of the assumptions of that metaphysics for granted and we don't question. And we seem to forget that for the majority of the people around the world, for the vast majority of the time, the idea of a creationist God just doesn't exist. The norm is monism, is not Judeo-Christian metaphysics. Spinoza returns to the norm, to what the vast majority of people, for the vast majority of time, actually believe. I think it's important to recognize that.
Yeah.
I would
Okay.
actually contest the radical uniqueness of Spinoza.
Yeah. Well, that leads me into my next point. Uh, I mean, yes, he's an original thinker. He's revolutionary for his time, but the arguments that he's advancing in the TTP are not really, it's not like original thinking. He's actually advancing the ideas of people who came before him, and I've made a quick list. So like Ibn Ezra, centuries before, had already argued that uh, Genesis, or the Pentateuch could not have been written by Moses. Isaac La Pereire also questions the authorship of Moses. He maintains that the Bible is a composition of multiple sources. His friend Meyer argues for an understanding of the true sense of the texts, being an allegorical reading similar to Maimonides and Ibn Rushd. His one of his biggest mentors, Van den Enden, sort of formulates his idea of true religion, which is the philosophical love of God and loving kindness for others. And the Dedecore brothers, who I mentioned earlier, who were big into Dutch republicanism and introduced him to Hobbes. So the to me, the TTP, it seems to like he's pulling together all of these threads from a lot of other thinkers and putting it into uh, a very a summary. So would you agree with that as well?
Oh,
That he's
absolutely, and I think
he's
every book is like that. I'm not aware of a book that is not like that. Even the first,
yeah
professional philosopher, Plato. I mean, there's this whole a lot of the history of Platonism is about the history of his followers trying to determine how original he was, and what was the influence of Parmenides or the influence of Pythagoras and his philosophy, and so on and so forth. I think, of course, there is no thinker who is absolutely original, but of course, thinkers bring different things together. I do think, however, that one crucial element that you find in Spinoza would not find in other modern philosophers is that, in my interpretation, as I presented in Spinoza the Epicurean, he is the first modern philosopher who has a systematic Epicurean, both political philosophy and ontology. And I'm not aware of anyone before him that does that. So I think
yeah
that's,
yeah
for me, what is unique about
yeah
Spinoza.
yeah. He was very systematic, especially his textual criticism of the Bible, specifically the Old Testament. Which that leads me to the next point, because he then goes in to do the New Testament, and it seems to me that he's very much pandering to the Christian audience in Europe when he gets to the section on the New Testament, and he talks about, and to some extent he's correct. He points to Jesus as being the embodiment of the true religion, the philosophical love of God and loving kindness to others, which encapsulates uh, what he said. There's I can't remember the exact biblical, the two great commandments. He's basically expounding the two great commandments, but that he's kind of sucking up a little bit to the Christians in Europe. The other issue I had was I'm sure you're familiar with the seven universal dogmas as well of Spinoza. Yes.
Yes, sure.
Yeah, so in I was so when I missed it originally when I was reading the TTP and making my notes. It didn't jump out at me at the time, but then what for our viewers, the seven universal dogmas are, he spent, and I have an excerpt here. Let me just find it and read it, because it seems so at odds with what he says everywhere else in his other writings. Um, so TTP chapter 14, this is, God is not only concerned with obedience, but he is actively judging and forgiving those who repent. And then where we go. So in chapter 14, number 25, anyone who doesn't know or doesn't believe that God exists cannot obey him as a judge. And then 28, finally, God pardons the sins of those who repent. So this is very much at odds with the ataraxia of, and what he's talking about in the ethics. Like, if you have reason, you can attain this peace of mind. So that these seven universal dogmas are really kind of at odds, and both Curly, and who else I got in here? Curly and someone else also mentioned that the universal dogmas are inconsistent. Where is it? If I can find it. Curly, Bennett. He says Curly, citing Bennett, comment that the seven universal dogmas are inconsistent. So, do you think in his section of the TTP on the New Testament, do you think he's and to use Curly's term, Edwin Curly, who's also another Spinoza expert, says he's pulling his punches in certain places. Like he's got to find that fine line. Like he really can't go too far, or he's going to end up in a lot of trouble. He's holding back to some extent.
There's a very strong interpretive tradition that agrees with exactly what you're presenting, and this has to do with various kind of reasons. One would be that we know that he read Hebrew very competently. In fact, at some point he was composing in Hebrew grammar, but he didn't read Greek. We know that he was educated in the Old Testament, but not in the New Testament. And there's the whole massive interpretive tradition to read Spinoza through the Jewish sources. So for all these reasons, there is a compelling argument to be made that he is indeed pulling his punches when he turns to the New Testament, and it is a kind of area where he doesn't feel incredibly comfortable. I'm aware of all this tradition and I acknowledge it, and I think it's really significant to be aware of all these issues. At the same time, it seems to me, well, 2 points in a sense. One is a typical kind of gesture that we find in Spinoza is to say, hey, I'm not saying anything radical here. I'm just saying what everybody else believes. And, like, I'll just say it in a slightly different terminology. It's basically what everybody else believes. We find that, for instance, in the chapter on miracles, when he says, well, if God is someone who encompasses everything, he's omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent, as the Judeo-Christian tradition describes him, then they can't really be miracles, properly speaking. Whoever believes in miracles is an atheist, because that means that a miracle is something that breaks the power of God, goes outside the power of that which encompasses everything. Of course, this is a highly heretical and atheistic, from the perspective of Christianity, perspective to adopt. However, it's a typical Spinoza gesture. Oh yeah, I'm not saying anything strange here. And when he turns to the New Testament and presents Christ as an exemplar, he adopts exactly the same strategy that he adopts in all sorts of different places. Now, however, if you look a little bit deeper and you pay attention to a number of strange turns in the argumentation, a different picture emerges, which may be not immediately obvious. To give you one example, but I think it's a very significant example. What is the most common reference in the Theological-Political treatise to the New Testament? The Sermon on the Mount. And from the Sermon on the Mount in particular, he highlights on a number of different places the so-called Golden Rule. Now,
the true religion, right?
Well, the Golden Rule that he associates with the true religion, but also historically in the 16th and 17th century, the Epicureans who want to avoid the accusation of being atheists. If you remember at the beginning of the conversation, I was saying that they translate the notion of sympheron, of utilitas, to the principle that from the best possible options. From all the good options, we take the best possible one. From all the bad options, we take the least evil one. Well, they associate that with the golden rule. This tradition continues all the way in the 19th century. We find Mills, for instance, in his essay on utilitarianism, the most programmatic essay on utilitarianism in the 19th century, to repeat exactly the same point, that the calculation of utility is nothing but the expression of the golden rule from the Sermon on the Mount. So, yes, I agree that on the one hand, the reliance on the Old Testament is much heavier and much more informed. I also agree that the references to the New Testament may seem lighter and much more conceding the point, so to speak. But I would caution, on the other hand, not to be duped by that, because it's part of that strategy of Spinoza to say, hey, I'm not saying anything new here. And to pay attention to what he's referring to. And then a different kind of picture emerges. A picture that would suggest a kind of slightly different reading of the Bible that is not exactly towing the line of a kind of doctrinaire or dogmatic reading of the Bible, but one that would allow for the radical materialist philosophy that is prevalent in the 17th century to find some kind of refuge in the New Testament and to avoid persecution by claiming, hey, that's what we're basing our materialist philosophy on, or Epicurean philosophy on.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think
And
the
then,
Sermon on the Mount is a crucial point of reference in that regard,
right.
which leads to all sorts of different implications in the theological-political treatise, like the notion of the true religion, as you mentioned.
Yeah. And the reaction, obviously, to the TTP was quite quite harsh, to say the least. One of Nadler's books is the title of the book is called "A Book Forged in Hell," which was a quote that somebody had when the TTP came out. That was the quote from one of the Dutch people. This was there's a quote from Stephen Nadler's book, Spinoza, A Life, and he writes, "The theological-political treatise is one of the most eloquent arguments for a secular democratic state in the history of political thought." And then, so that leads me to my next question is, do you, in your opinion, do you think Spinoza seeded the Enlightenment with the TTP?
Clearly not. I,
No?
I, I can't see how. It depends on what you mean by enlightenment, and depends on what you mean by seated. I'm not.
Well, just
I'm not exactly
because
sure
like
what you mean.
because he was so influential on so many of the 18th century Enlightenment thinkers. Um, Like even Jonathan Israel, in his book, I believe it was Enlightenment Now. Let me just take a quick,
Mhm.
sorry, Enlightenment Contested. Um, sorry, it might have been in one of his other books.
The radical enlightenment.
Yeah, he talks about Spinoza basically sparked the radical enlightenment, that you have these
Mhm.
two strains where Spinoza basically
Mhm.
gives no quarter to religion, but Hobbes and Locke and others, they give some quarter to religion. And so that Spinoza was very, very key to that radical side of the Enlightenment. So, and it's kind of hard to pin down exactly when the Enlightenment started, but some scholars do think that Spinoza basically lit the match by influencing those later 18th century thinkers who really kicked off the Enlightenment.
Yeah, no, look, I mean, I know Jonathan's book, The Radical Enlightenment, is a mind-blowing book in many ways, but I do think that the case for Spinoza's influence on the Enlightenment is somewhat overstated. I mean, if we take a figure like Rousseau, for instance, who is an absolutely crucial figure for the lead up to the French Revolution. I just cannot see the influence of Spinoza in Rousseau. I cannot see the influence of Spinoza in a figure like Kant, who provides the framework of modern philosophy. I cannot see the influence of um, Spinoza in um, the whole kind of Scottish Enlightenment tradition, and that includes Hume, Adam Smith, and all these other people. So, yeah, I think reading Jonathan Israel's book, it is really a mind-blowing experience. And yet, it seems to me that the absolutely crucial figures of the Enlightenment are really absent there. I mean, the sort of major kind of line that Jonathan is tracing is through figures that a lot of them I had never heard of before, and many many students at the university will never ever encounter in their studies. And sure, there is no question, there's no question that within a kind of educated milieu in Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries and 19th centuries, there is a kind of recognition that there is a tradition of thought that is different from the Judeo-Christian metaphysics that has dominated thought for so long. And within that tradition, the monist tradition, as Christian Wolff called it in the 18th century, within that tradition, Spinoza is a crucial figure. But also, we shouldn't forget that Spinoza's books were inaccessible. People couldn't obtain them. People were not reading them. And Spinoza was more or less a forgotten figure by the end of the 18th century.
Right. Interesting. Okay. Well, it's been just over an hour now. I know you need to go and take care of your personal stuff. Any parting thoughts you'd like to share on Spinoza?
Uh, Look, I think it's really important to um, recognize the influence of two profound traditions in reading Spinoza. One comes through Deleuze, and the other comes through Leo Strauss. The Deleuze tradition is the tradition that reads Spinoza as a Stoic, and the Leo Strauss is the tradition that reads Spinoza as a liberal thinker. What would it be like to work around these two traditions and to read Spinoza with new eyes that are not influenced by the Deleuzian and the Straussian interpretations? That's what the wager of Spinoza the Epicurean was. And I would invite anyone who's interested in Spinoza to try to follow that path. It doesn't mean agreeing with me, it doesn't mean even agreeing that Spinoza is an Epicurean, but it does mean challenging the sort of two calcified traditions, two calcified approaches to Spinoza that seem to hold so much sway in the academic world nowadays.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for your time and for your thoughts. I
Thank you so much
appreciate
for the
your
wonderful
insights.
conversation, Jason. I mean, this was really incredible. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. And hopefully our viewers will like this. And please check out the description. There'll be a link there to his book if those of you who want to read it. It's a little more on the academic side than it is for general reading. But if you're into this kind of stuff, please check it out. It was a great book and it was hugely influential on helping my understanding and crystallizing my writing. So we'd like to wrap up our inaugural episode of the podcast. And once again, Dimitri, thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for all the help you gave me and sending me a copy of your book. I really appreciate it. So, okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. All right, so I'm not sure when the next podcast will be. It's basically kind of hit and miss on schedules because professors are obviously very busy.
Mhm.
But the nature of this podcast, Intellectual Conversations, is to speak to scholars and academics who have an expertise in a specific field. So it's going to be a bit hit and miss how often these podcasts come out as we play with schedules. So anyway, thank you everybody for watching. I hope you enjoyed this first podcast, and I look forward to my next conversation. So take care, everybody, and we'll see you next time. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching.
Please check out the other videos on my channel if history is your thing, and see you next time.